I'm very interested in everything what the speaker had to say, but I'm going to pick on Professor Peters specifically, if you don't mind. It's very interesting you were talking about congestion charging in Manhattan. I was one of the originators in the London congestion charging scheme. And I suppose it really depends on what the purpose of the congestion charging is. Is it economic? Is it environmental? Or is it, just purely, I suppose, like with bridges, tolls to just raising money? And it depends as well whether the taxi industry is genuinely seen as part of the transport infrastructure. Because if it is part of the transport infrastructure, the idea is to create a modal shift for passengers maybe to use, in inverted commas, public transport, and therefore if the passengers have to pay tolls, it's actually self-defeating. I wondered if you could comment on that, and that was why in London, for instance,
taxis are free. I know we've had an ongoing...
They are seen as part of the infrastructure.
New York City tolls are not about congestion charging, and I want to just say I was rushing along. I want to just acknowledge my partner to my right here. Dave King has been working with us, and we've been really working hard with the data, and Dave was very instrumental in getting the data to us. And we've been working together, and my research team I mentioned in my presentation, but it's a broad research team. We're looking at a lot of aspects of this. And my information I'm sharing with you about the congestion charge was not that what should we do about the pricing of taxis in the congestion zone, but that in the discussion of the congestion zone, they didn't have good street level traffic flow information, and that the taxi cab data actually, I think, can actually inform them a lot about the street conditions, both historically and on a forward-going basis. Now, the New York City congestion zone is very similar. The proposal is very similar to the London charging zone in terms of its design. It was copied essentially off of the London zone. And it hasn't been implemented. It failed in the state legislature, but it's not dead. It's like a vampire because everybody's short of money, and so it's coming back. And one of the big discussion points has been, do you charge taxis? Do you charge them one time a day? Do you charge them by trip? What's interesting about the taxi data, which I didn't know when the discussion was going on, is how much of the congestion load at certain streets in Manhattan is taxi traffic. So it is a question. Are you trying to raise revenue? You're trying to get people to shift to taxis as one of the modes that might be sustainable. So there's a lot of outcomes. You just got to decide what your goals are. Dave?
If I could just add one thing to that. There's a number of unofficial proposals about congestion pricing in Manhattan as well, and very often there's sort of a shifting of additional fees onto taxis, which is seen as being politically okay because we don't understand the equity implications and we don't understand the social welfare implications of taxi usage. And that the users of taxis, while there certainly are plenty of very wealthy people who can afford high fees and high fares using taxis, there's also a lot of low-income people who use taxis. And that is just not very well understood. And it leads to, within the policymaking community, a lot of confusion about, what's the optimal charge.
If you're trying to raise revenue, if you make the taxi exempt, then it's a problem because it does undermine your revenue stream. And again, if you charge 50 cents a trip with 500,000 trips, a lot of them occurring inside the congestion zone, it's a lot of money per day, probably $125,000, $200,000 just with a 50-cent charge per day.
Okay. We have. If we could just use the microphones, that would be great so we can hear you.
New York City data, or is that major U.S. cities?
It's New York City data.
New York City data. Is it adjusted for inflation?
I think it was the blue line was adjusted for inflation, and then the red line was just the average fare. So adjusted for inflation, the fares have remained very stable in real terms. Even though the fare has gone up, but adjusted for inflation, and we're now at a point where it's about equal, but adjusted for inflation, the fares have been remarkably stable.
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully, you're going to that information will be be available to us at some point? Or
Yeah, and the slides that I presented were drawn from the poster that we have across the way. So you can, and there's some additional text there that you can refer to. And if you're interested in the working draft that we have, send me or John or Matt an email, and we can arrange for you to get the working paper.
Okay, great. Jim and then Naomi, and if we could ask, we have some minutes left here before we break. If we could really get your input on, we had the broad categories we discussed, with both James and I did. Are there any categories we're missing? And in those categories, do you want to see as regulators specific studies? Okay, do you want to see a specific study regarding GPS? If you could, make some comments on that, that's very helpful to us in determining where to go. We have Jim first and Naomi.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jim Nye. I'm the taxi regulator from Philadelphia. And actually speaking someone with a planning background and now as an administrator of taxis and limousines, I think this stuff has tremendous application to our industry. Just a couple of things. Working out geographical overlaps with other jurisdictions and regulatory agencies, working out those responsibilities of one another and where one should leave off and the other should, begin. Setting service regulations for drivers. You mentioned you talked about some drivers who tend to do only one type of taxi service in a jurisdiction. They tend to either do hails or they tend to do airport trips and that type of thing. And actually to show levels of income for drivers and basically point out to them that they need to do more types of service in their jurisdictions. Basically, you had pointed out, you keep talking about are taxis being phased out? Are they necessary with these new types of transportation coming in? Well, in Philadelphia, I live in the downtown area. I use taxis. I use the car sharing services because I don't have a car, and many of my friends and neighbors do the same thing. They're all flourishing at the same time. They're all necessary.
Okay. Yes. Naomi?
Hi, I'm Naomi Nightingale, and I'm from the Coachella Valley, where we have about 130 taxis to serve our area. I've been working in public transit for many years at Los Angeles, which is the third largest public transportation agency in the country. And in LA, their taxis and public transit are not compatible according to the leadership there. And so in the Coachella Valley, I am both the taxi administrator and the director of administration on the public transit side. I wear two hats. What I'd like from this group is to find out how I can keep on one hat to deal with both of those issues and to see how we can integrate taxi service and public transit services. From Los Angeles, when we went from public transit to rail transit, it created a bus rider union because the issue there was rich versus poor. I see the same potential for taxi use as it integrates into probable use in public transit, where we have people who are in lesser economic incomes saying that they cannot afford to take a taxi. We're currently implementing a voucher program that will help disabled and seniors use taxi services, and we're hoping to be able to extend that to low-income people. But without the assistance of federal monies to support that, it does become an economic issue in terms of people being able to utilize taxi services in an integrated mode with public transit. So as a research project, I'd like to have some assistance and response from that. Thank you.
Okay. Ray, did you want to answer it?
I was going to say, let me just respond briefly, Naomi, to you. I am somewhat familiar with Coachella Valley. you run a difficult sort of situation when you are the transit system and you're also then managing taxi cabs. It seems like a simplistic thing to start with, but you might want to start calling yourself, instead of the taxi regulator, call yourself the mobility regulator, or take out the word regulator. You're the taxi facilitator. You are the mobility facilitator. And get the word regulator out of it, because that has a negative connotation, as others have made. But in the case of your situation there, taxi cabs can play a role for early morning service, late evening service. You can integrate the two with your voucher system. You also have the taxi companies there with a great ability to serve really ADA trips that aren't necessarily wheelchair required. You have the ability to use the taxi service to get individuals to the transit service so that they are linked services. So there is a tremendous opportunity. There's always going to be suspicion by your drivers that, you know, you're out for the transit system, you're not out for them, but literally by attempting to get more market demand for them and develop that demand to lower your transit costs, you can have a win-win for both the taxi industry and the, in this case, the transit industry. Saving cost and improving service at the same time.
If I may comment that information from a research team like yours will help policy for our board, because we have two separate boards, one for public transit and one for taxi. With research that supports mobility, we could probably urge those and then focus on the mobility agenda rather than two separate.
I think you're correct.
Can I add just one elephant to this room, and I think it's one you've touched on, is the funding that we have both in the research community and in the taxi element of transit. No funds. And I would urge this group to look to the DOTs to bring taxis properly into TCRP, and in terms of supply, to fund it properly in providing service.
Okay. And we're going to hear a little bit more at 11:45 about the paratransit reform and you know, how much money is being wasted by the government by not using taxis more. Yes?
So we have an issue in Montreal about taxi fuel and fuel consummation. The city would like to implement a plan forcing all new vehicles that comes in the taxi industry to consume 6 liters per 100 kilometers or less. Now we know that right now these kind of cars don't meet the taxi standard for the size of the car or to go to the airport. But what we know is that public transport uses a math formula saying that a bus saves the equivalent of 50 vehicles per day, even though the bus is not full. So my question is there a study, or is it possible to evaluate how much of each taxi would save on the fuel consumption, not taking the what the car industry says, only written like saying it's 6 liters per 100 kilometers. But if taxi, as an average, takes 1, 2, 3 passengers, depending on the study, then we can say what's the average consumption that we're saving. And that will help us, because the politicians are very sensible in Montreal, but I think that for other cities, it could be the same.
Okay. It's a great idea.
I think one of the great advantages, and when you get into the economic and environmental impacts of taxi usage, you have to think about these in more complex ways. I know Dr. King and I have been thinking a lot about how does taxi availability lead to 0, 1, or 2 auto households. The big secret in the 8 million people who live inside New York City's borders is there's about 2 million, 1.5 or 2 million private automobiles, with some 3-car households. And so one of the things that might be a big advantage of the taxis is that vehicle, as Dave pointed out before, the issue of car share, right, and the impact on parking.